Welcome back. Get comfortable. Let everything slow. Before the Age of Sigmar, there was another world. Not a world that faded slowly, not a world that was abandoned. A world that ended, completely, violently, in fire and dark and the laughter of gods who had waited thousands of years for exactly this moment. The Warhammer fantasy world, the old world, was the setting of a different story. A world of great human empires and ancient elven kingdoms, of dwarven grudges and skaven schemes, of forests that whispered and mountains that remembered. It was a world that had been fighting chaos for as long as anyone could remember, and the fighting had kept chaos at bay through heroism and sacrifice, and the specific stubbornness of mortal civilizations that refused to accept that they could be defeated. They were defeated, as Archaon and the End Times. His name, before it was erased under the weight of what he became, was Diedrich Kastner. He was a devout Sigmarite Templar, a warrior of intense faith, a man who believed completely in the God King Sigmar and the divine order Sigmar represented. He prayed, he served, he fought for everything the Empire of Man claimed to stand for. And then he discovered who his father was. What Kastner learned about his birth, about the dark powers that had shaped the circumstances of his existence, broke the faith that had organized his entire life. He went to the Temple of Sigmar in Altdorf and knelt before the golden statue of the God King and asked for a sign. Any sign. Some indication that the divine existed and cared and was present in the world it was supposed to protect. The statue stood silent, and from that silence came Archaon, the ever-chosen, the three-eyed king, the champion of chaos who would bring about the end of the known world. Not willingly, not with enthusiasm, but with the specific bitterness of a man who had been denied what he needed most, and had decided that if the gods could not maintain the world he had believed in, then the world deserved what was coming. Archaon spent years gathering the 6 treasures of chaos, relics of extraordinary power scattered across the world, each one requiring extraordinary effort to acquire. He built an army from the tribes of the north, from the followers of all 4 chaos gods, from every being that had decided civilization was a lie and destruction was more honest. And then he marched. The End Times were not a single battle. They were a cascade, each catastrophe enabling the next, each fall of a great power, removing one more barrier between the world and what was coming. The forces of order, humanity, elves, dwarves, undead under Nagash's uneasy cooperation, fought back with everything they had. Great heroes made their last stands. Ancient alliances were formed that would have been impossible under any other circumstances. It was not enough. Archaon reached the center of the world. The Chaos Gods poured through the cracks in reality that his campaign had opened. The Skaven, the rat men who had been building toward this moment for centuries, detonated the Doomsphere and destroyed the moon, flooding the world with warpstone radiation. The forces of destruction fed on each other and on everything else. The world ended, not slowly, not metaphorically. The physical globe of the Warhammer fantasy setting was torn apart by the unleashed power of chaos, its continents consumed, its civilizations obliterated. 99 out of every 100 beings that had ever lived on it, killed in the destruction. The gods of the old world died or were transformed beyond recognition. The races that had built kingdoms and cultures across thousands of years were reduced to scattered survivors or simply ceased to exist. Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess, had been waiting for this moment with specific anticipation. As the elves died, the high elves, the dark elves, the wood elves, all the elven peoples who had been the most spiritually refined beings in the world, Slaanesh consumed their souls. He feasted on what had taken thousands of years to cultivate. The elven population of the world was devoured in what felt, from Slaanesh's perspective, like a single extraordinary meal. This was both catastrophe and consequence. The end times produced the end of the world, and the end of the world produced the specific appetite of a chaos god that would define the next age's politics in ways that no one yet understood. The last moments, in the final moments of the world's destruction, as the planet came apart and the void began to claim what the flames had not already consumed, certain beings survived through extraordinary means. The lizard men, the ancient reptilian servants of the old ones, who had been maintaining the great plan for existence across hundreds of thousands of years, had been prepared. Their Slaan mage priests, the most powerful spellcasters in the world, had known this was coming. They had built their pyramid temples as arcs. When the world ended, the Slaan guided their temple ships into the void, carrying what populations of saurian warriors and skinks they could accommodate, sailing into the cosmic darkness toward whatever came next. The elven gods, Tyrion, Teclis, Malerion, Morathi, survived through divine resilience and through the specific power of beings who had transcended ordinary mortality. They scattered into the void, carrying whatever fragments of elven souls they could protect from Slaanesh's feast. Grungni and Grimnir, the Duardin gods, survived. The great horned rat, the god of the Skolven, whose followers had played no small role in the world's destruction, ascended in the chaos of the ending and claimed the divine status that his servant's success had earned him. Nagash, the god of undeath, whose power is rooted in death itself and therefore somewhat resistant to being killed by it, survived in the void. And Sigmar survived. Sigmar and the core. Sigmar Heldenhammer had once been immortal, a barbarian king who had united the tribes of man through strength and wisdom, who had wielded the divine hammer, Gal Maraz, who had founded the empire and been elevated to godhood by the faith of the people he had protected. He had watched over the world for thousands of years as its divine protector. When the world came apart, Sigmar did something that divine beings rarely do. He refused. Not in the sense of fighting the destruction. The destruction was beyond fighting, at that scale. He refused to let go, and as the planet's core, the last coherent piece of the world that was, hurtled through the void after the destruction of everything around it, Sigmar clung to it, literally. The God King held onto the last burning fragment of his world and refused to release his grip, even as the void stretched around him in all directions and everything he had ever protected ceased to exist. He held on for an unknowable period of time. Time does not work normally in the void between existences. What felt like moments may have been ages. What felt like ages may have been seconds. Sigmar drifted through nothing, holding on to ash, watching the light of his world's core slowly diminish, too stubborn or too lost to let go. Then Dracothion found him, armed Dracothion and the mortal realms. Dracothion is described in Age of Sigmar lore as a great celestial drake, a being of cosmic scale and divine nature, who moves through the spaces between realities as easily as a dragon moves through air. He is sometimes called the Great Drake, sometimes the Celestial Serpent. He is old in ways that precede the world Sigmar came from. He existed in the spaces the old world was not aware of. He was drawn to the burning core that Sigmar was clinging to, drawn to the light of it, to the specific divine signature of a god refusing to die. What he found was Sigmar, diminished, half mad from the drift through nothing, covered in the ash of everything he had lost, but still present, still holding on. Dracothion guided Sigmar to the mortal realms. The mortal realms are 8 interconnected planes of existence, not planets, not simple locations, but entire dimensional realities, each one a world in itself, each one organized around one of the fundamental principles that the old world's winds of magic had represented. They had formed from the energies released by the old world's destruction, guided into shape by the laws of the cosmos that the destruction had not managed to unmake. Azur, the realm of heavens, the realm of storms and lightning, of celestial power, of the vast cold clarity of the sky at its extreme. This is where Sigmar found sanctuary. This is where he built what came next. Garen, the realm of life, green and vast and teeming, the place where growing things exist at their most essential. Alariel, the goddess of the natural world, had found her way here, Shaiish, the realm of death, the furthest realm from life organized around the concept of ending and what comes after. Nagash had claimed it as his own. Gore, the realm of beasts, primal, violent, a place where the law of strength governs everything and predators define the landscape. Gorka Morka, the great double-headed god of the greenskins, was there. Akshi, the realm of fire, volcanic, fierce, organized around the power of flames, both literal and metaphorical. Shaman, the realm of metal, precise and enduring and complex, the realm of crafted things and the secrets of their making. Ulgu, the realm of shadow, obscure and shifting, the domain of illusion and concealment, and the specific darkness that is not the absence of light, but the presence of something else. Hish, the realm of light, the counterpart to Ulgu, the place of illumination and revelation, and the specific clarity that comes from being able to see everything. Each realm was its own world. Each had inhabitants who had developed there, civilizations, creatures, beings of extraordinary variety who had lived in these 8 planes without knowing what Sigmar was, what had come before, what was going to happen to them when the God King arrived with his grief and his hammer and his stubborn refusal to accept that things could not be rebuilt. The long recovery. Sigmar spent time, much time, unspecified in duration, the kind of time that gods measure differently than mortals. In Azir before he was ready to move. He grieved what was lost. He assessed what remained. He gathered the divine beings he could find. Nagash, who came with his characteristic self-interest. Gorka Morka, who came with his characteristic enthusiasm for a fight. Alariel, who came with her characteristic beauty and grief. The elven gods who came carrying the trauma of what Slaanesh had done to their people. The Pantheon of order formed in this period. An alliance of divine beings, each bringing their specific power to the shared project of building something in the mortal realms that was worth protecting. It was not a coalition of friends. Nagash was always planning something. Gorkamorka was always bored of peace. The elven gods were pursuing their own agendas regarding the souls Slaanesh had consumed. The alliance was built on necessity rather than trust, on the shared understanding that what threatened the mortal realms threatened all of them. For a time, what is called the Age of Myth, it worked. Civilizations rose. Mortals built cities and kingdoms across the 8 realms. The gods walked among their people in ways that made the Age of Myth feel, to those who lived in it, like a golden age. There was trade between the realms through the Realmgates, magical portals connecting the 8 planes to each other. There was learning, there was building, there was the specific texture of civilization at its most optimistic, the sense that things were going in a direction worth going. But the Pantheon was fragile, and the Chaos Gods were watching, and what had ended one world was already beginning to find the cracks in the next one. Sleep well. The Age of Myth is just beginning, and its ending is already on its way. Welcome back. Let everything slow. The Age of Myth. When Sigmar arrived in the mortal realms, guided by Dracothian through the 8 planes that had formed from the energies of the old world's destruction, he found something that was not the world he had lost. It was not better. It was not worse. It was new. The mortal realms were vast in ways that the old world had never been. Each of the 8 planes was an entire reality in itself. Azir, with its endless storms and celestial grandeur. Giran blooming with life in every form. Shyish organized around the concept of death and what lies beyond it. Gur primal and violent, where the strongest defined the law. The other 4 realms similarly. Akshi burning with fire and passion. Shaman precise with the logic of metal and craft. Ulgu shifting with shadow and illusion. Hish clear with the light of revelation. These realms had inhabitants before Sigmar arrived. Not the same as the peoples of the old world, but recognizable in outline. Humans who called themselves by different names. Dordin, the dwarven people, who had developed their own civilizations. Elves scattered in small communities. Creatures of every description, many of them enormous, most of them predatory. Beings of magical nature inhabiting the places where magic pooled. Sigmar travelled among them, not as a conqueror, or not primarily as one, but as a god exploring what he had been given. He formed alliances. He fought when he had to. He hunted down the great monsters that threatened the smaller civilizations and removed them, not from military strategy, but from the specific protective impulse that had made him a king before it made him a god. He gathered the other divine survivors. Nagash was found buried under a mountain in Shyish, the god of undeath, reduced by the end times to something diminished but present. Sigmar excavated him, restored him to something functional, and invited him to the Pantheon. Nagash accepted. He was, in the law's observation, the most unlikely ally and the most obvious traitor. But for a time, he chose the alliance over his own particular agenda. Gorkamorka, the great double-headed god of the Oryx, part Gork and part Morg, 2 divine beings who had merged into one enormous force of green-skinned violence, was found in Gur. locked in an eternal struggle with a being called Krakatoa, the living avalanche. Sigmar helped him. By way of thanks, Gorkamorka attacked Sigmar. They fought for a long time, both of them genuinely enjoying it, and became friends in the specific way that beings who respect strength become friends, through the establishment of mutual regard achieved through mutual violence. The elven gods came separately, each carrying their own grief and their own agenda. Tyrion, Lord of Light, and his twin brother Teclis, the greatest mortal wizard elevated to divine status. Malarian, once called Malekith, the Witch King of the Old World, now transformed into something darker and stranger by his passage through the realm of chaos. Morathi, his mother, equally transformed, equally ambitious, equally dangerous. These four had been working together on a project that would define their entire presence in the mortal realms. Somewhere between the realms of light and shadow, Slaanesh was imprisoned. The elven gods had trapped the Chaos God, who had feasted on their people at the old world's ending, and was slowly, carefully extracting the Eye-Elf souls that Slaanesh had consumed. This was the secret at the heart of the elven divine agenda throughout the Age of Myth. Every decision the elven gods made was organized around the dual imperatives of keeping Slaanesh imprisoned and recovering what Slaanesh had eaten. The new elven peoples, the Ideneth Deepkin, the Daughters of Cain, the Lumineth Realm Lords, were built from recovered elf souls, each faction representing a different god's approach to the problem of recreating an elven civilization from the fragments of the one that had been devoured. Grungni and Grimnir, the Duardin gods, joined. Grimnir would eventually sacrifice himself in a great battle against a titanic fire monster, scattering his essence across the realms in shards that would become the basis of the Fireslayer culture. Duardin who mine and use those sacred shards as a form of devotion. Grungni took a different path. The master craftsman, the maker of things, who would spend the Age of Myth building and teaching and eventually exile himself from the Pantheon, out of the specific grief of feeling he had failed his people. Together, these gods formed the Pantheon of Order. They met in a city called Highheim, the parliament of the gods, and established the structures that would govern the mortal realms during what became their golden age. The civilizations of the Age of Myth. What the Pantheon built, with divine guidance and mortal labor over centuries, was extraordinary. Cities rose across all 8 realms. The Realmgates, magical portals connecting the 8 planes to each other, became the arteries of a civilization that spanned an entire cosmos. Trade moved between realms. Knowledge accumulated. The peoples of the mortal realms developed arts and sciences and cultures specific to their environments. The Duardan of Shamon built cities of metal of astonishing precision. The humans of Akshi developed cultures organized around fire and the specific passion that fire suggests. At the Sylvaneth, the tree-like beings who were Alariel's children grew in the forests of Giran, tending the natural world they were part of. The Seraphon, the lizardmen, who had escaped the old world's destruction in their temple ships, guided by the cosmic plans of their Slan masters, worked to maintain the celestial order of the realms. This is described in Age of Sigmar lore as a time without precedent. The gods were present and accessible. The realms were prosperous. The civilizations that had formed in the wake of the old world's destruction were building something that exceeded what came before. But the Pantheon was fragile in ways that only became visible under pressure. Nagash was always scheming. His specific ambition, to claim dominion over all souls in the mortal realms, living and dead, to build a divine kingdom of undeath that would eventually encompass everything, was not compatible with a Pantheon organized around coexistence. He participated in the Pantheon because it was useful. When it stopped being useful, he would stop participating. Gorkamorka grew bored. The specific nature of Orug divinity is organized around violence and the joy of it. The War, the perpetual state of war that greenskin civilization expresses as a form of worship. Peacetime was something Gorkamorka could tolerate for a limited duration. The specific alliance that required him to sit in councils and make agreements was not his natural environment. He was held in the Pantheon by respect for Sigmar and by the entertainment value of divine company. When the entertainment faded, he left. The elven gods were pursuing their own project. Their presence in the Pantheon was always conditional on the Pantheon not interfering with what they were doing to Slaanesh and not discovering how they were rebuilding elven civilization. They were allies of convenience, not of trust, and chaos was patient. The Age of Chaos begins. The transition from the Age of Myth to the Age of Chaos was not a single event. It was a process, slow at first, then accelerating, then catastrophic. Chaos agents had been working in the mortal realms throughout the Age of Myth. Not large armies, not open invasion, but the specific quiet work that chaos does best. Corruption, manipulation, the slow erosion of institutions and beliefs, and the specific trust that civilization requires to function. Mortals were offered gifts by the Chaos gods. Power in exchange for service. Insight are in exchange for devotion. The gifts were real. The cost was typically also real, and typically larger than the initial terms suggested. The cracks widened. The divine presence of the Pantheon kept the worst of it at bay, but the Pantheon was not unified enough to respond to everything. An Archaon, who had survived the destruction of the old world and found himself in the mortal realms, with an army, a grudge, and a specific appetite for proving that order cannot be sustained, began to move. The critical moment came at the Battle of the Burning Skies in Akshi. Archaon unified the forces of chaos in a rare display of coordination and attacked with an army large enough to test even the combined Pantheon. The battle was fierce. Sigmar, Gorkamorka, Ayaz and others fought together with the specific effectiveness of gods who had been cooperating for an age. For a moment, it looked like the Pantheon would hold. Then Nagash did not come. Sigmar had sent word to every member of the Pantheon. Nagash received the message and made a calculation. If he stayed away, and if Chaos and Sigmar fought to mutual exhaustion, he could pick up the pieces from a position of strength. More war meant more dead. More dead meant more potential soldiers for his undead legions. The mathematics were, from Nagash's perspective, entirely reasonable. The problem was that Sigmar lost more badly than Nagash had anticipated. Archaon's forces prevailed at the Burning Skies. Sigmar, furious at Nagash's absence, and pursued Nagash through Shyish in a destructive rage, inadvertently releasing a being called Ushoran from one of Nagash's prisons, a former favorite who had been driven insane by centuries of imprisonment and would go on to found the Flesh-Eater Courts. This is how the Age of Chaos begins. Not cleanly, not clearly, but in the specific chaos of a pantheon already fracturing under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Gorkamorka left next, not as betrayal, simply as Gorkamorka being Gorkamorka. The peace was over, the war was interesting again, and the specific interest he had in organized defense of civilization was exhausted. He led a massive war through the realms, his departure pulling the Greenskin and Grot and Trogoth civilizations away from any allegiance to order and into the primal violence that is their natural expression. Alariel retreated. Nurgle, the chaos god of decay and rot, had set his eyes on Garen, the realm of life, and was transforming it with methodical patience into something that expressed his specific aesthetic. Teeming, overflowing, life and death blended into a fever dream of growth and corruption simultaneously. Alariel fought him across Garen and could not win. She retreated to her most sacred sanctuary and hid there, in a despair so deep that she dismissed her own guardians. One by one, the Pantheon dissolved under the pressure of a chaos invasion that none of them had been organized enough to collectively oppose. Sigmar retreated to Azir, and he sealed the realm gates behind him, closing off the realm of heavens from the rest of the mortal realms, abandoning everything outside it to what was coming. This is described as his most controversial decision. The god, who had rebuilt civilization in the wake of the old world's destruction, choosing to watch 7 realms fall to chaos, rather than sacrifice Azir. The Age of Chaos lasted for approximately 500 years. The Long Dark, 500 years. That is the duration of the Age of Chaos in the mortal realms. 5 centuries during which Archaon's forces and the demonic hosts of the 4 Chaos gods and the corrupted mortal armies that served them held dominion over most of the known world. The civilizations of the Age of Myth were destroyed or enslaved. The cities that had taken centuries to build were torn down or transformed into chaos fortresses. The populations that had lived in those cities were killed, enslaved, corrupted, or scattered into desperate pockets of resistance that hid in the most inhospitable places they could find. Some survived by hiding, some survived by fighting. Guerrilla wars against an enemy too vast to defeat in open battle, holding on through the specific stubbornness of people who had nowhere to go and nothing left to lose except the fighting itself. Some survived by serving chaos, becoming part of the machinery of oppression, the specific moral compromise of those who collaborate with what they cannot overcome. The gods who had not sealed themselves away fought as they could. Nagash, in Shyish, approved that even chaos armies have difficulty killing the god of undeath, and maintained a grim and diminished presence in his realm. The elven gods continued their project, hidden between realms, extracting souls from Slaanesh in the darkness, while everything else burned. In Azir, Sigmar was not idle. He watched the mortal realms burn through the visions that his divine sight provided. He counted the losses. He grieved, though gods grieve differently than mortals. The specific weight of watching 500 years of civilization being destroyed is not nothing even for a being of divine resilience. And he planned. What he built during those 500 years was what he had decided. In the long dark of watching everything die, I was the only answer to a chaos that could not be defeated by conventional means. warriors who could not die. The Stormcast Eternals. The concept is elegant in its cruelty. Conventional armies, mortals with swords and shields, and the specific courage of beings who know they can die, had failed against chaos. Not because they lacked bravery or skill, but because chaos was infinite in its supply of warriors and mortal civilizations were not infinite in theirs. Every dead soldier was a permanent loss. Every dead chaos warrior was simply a reduction in an inexhaustible supply. What Sigmar needed was warriors who could be recovered from death, not undead, not Nagash's specific approach to persistence, which came with its own theological complications. Something different. Mortal heroes, elevated, transformed, and made capable of dying and returning in a way that chaos could not simply outlast. The process he developed, with help from Grungni, the master craftsman of the Duardin gods, and the 6 smiths who served him, was called reforging. A soul selected by Sigmar, taken from the mortal battlefields of the mortal realms, chosen for specific qualities of honor and courage and faith, was brought to Azir and to a great structure called the Anvil of Apotheosis. There, it was blasted apart by the celestial energies of Azir and rebuilt, beaten into a new form, elevated beyond mortal limitation and into something that was no longer simply human, but carried the essence of what the human had been. The result was a Stormcast Eternal, tall beyond ordinary human scale, encased in Sigmarite armor, wielding weapons of divine craftsmanship, capable of descending from Azir on bolts of lightning to strike at specific targets with overwhelming force, and then, when killed, being called back to Azir to be reforged again. The crucial detail that the Stormcast have learned to understand about themselves. Each reforging costs something, not something visible, not something that can be measured precisely, but something real, a memory that does not return, an emotional connection that has frayed, the specific texture of who they were before the first reforging, becoming, over multiple deaths and rebirths, less accessible. Veterans of many reforgings become people who know they have lost things they cannot name, who carry the specific grief of absence without content. Sigmar built his army over the decades of the long wait. He trained them in Azir, hunting the great beasts of the celestial realm, practicing in the magical training ground called the Gladiatorium, preparing for the moment when they would be unleashed. When that moment came, they came as lightning. The first strike, the first Stormcast Eternals to descend with the hammers of Sigmar, the founding storm host clad in gold and blue, the warriors who had been reforged first and trained longest, and who carried Sigmar's specific hopes for what his army could be. They descended on the Brimstone Peninsula in Akshi, a location chosen for the Realmgate there, the Whispering Gate, which connected the realm of fire to the broader network of Realmgates across the mortal realms. If they could secure this gate, they could begin to project force across the realms without relying solely on direct lightning deployment. The Chaos forces who had been occupying the mortal realms for 500 years had never faced anything like the Stormcast. They were used to mortal resistance, brave and futile, meaningful but ultimately temporary. They had no framework for warriors who came on lightning, fought with divine weapons, and when killed, simply dissolved into bolts of light that returned to Azir. The first Stormcast strikes were devastating. Centuries of accumulated chaos occupation began to give way before an enemy that the usual arithmetic did not apply to. 500 years of conquest was not undone in a single campaign. The Age of Sigmar that followed would be defined by the ongoing struggle to reclaim what had been lost, not a clean victory. But the lightning had struck, and the realms that had burned under chaos for 5 centuries had something they had not had since the Pantheon fell. They had hope, and they had thunder. Sleep well. The wars of the mortal realms are only beginning. Welcome back. Let everything slow. Sigmar's Tempest. The day the Realmgate Wars began was called, in the accounts that survived it, the day of Sigmar's Tempest. Every realm in the mortal realms, 7 of the 8, the 7 that had spent 5 centuries under chaos occupation, saw the same thing at the same moment. The sky lit by lightning that did not come from clouds. Azure bolts of celestial energy descending from a storm that had opened in the heavens, striking near the sealed gates of Azir that had been closed when Sigmar retreated. Each bolt carried a retinue of Stormcast Eternals. The Chaos forces who had occupied the mortal realms for 500 years had never encountered anything like this. They had defeated mortal armies. Armies of humans and Duardin and Arls who bled and died and stayed dead. These golden warriors came on lightning, fought with divine weapons, and when killed dissolved into azure light that returned to Azure to be reforged. The mathematics that chaos had relied on, the arithmetic of attrition, the grinding certainty that infinite supply defeats finite resistance, did not apply. For the first time in centuries, the forces occupying the mortal realms knew something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. The specific calculation that this enemy could not simply be outlasted. The first major engagement was on the Brimstone Peninsula in Akshi, the realm of fire. The hammers of Sigmar, the founding storm host, the first reforged, the warriors who had waited the longest in Azir for the moment they had been made for, descended against the forces of Kragnos Kul, a chaos lord devoted to Khorne, who had been building his realm of fire empire for generations. Lord Celestant Vandus Hammerhand led the assault. Their goal was the Whispering Gate, the Realmgate in that region, which if secured would allow Sigmar to project force through it into the broader network. They fought. They secured the gate. The first outpost of order in the mortal realms had been claimed. This was not a victory in any comprehensive sense. It was a beachhead, a single point of light in 7 realms of darkness. But the strategy was clear. Secure realm gates, build from those gates outward, gradually establish enough territory to build cities, and allow the non-Stormcast populations of the realms to begin rebuilding what the Age of Chaos had destroyed. Read the Realmgate Wars, a campaign across 8 planes. What followed was not a single war, but 1,000 wars. Campaigns in every realm simultaneously, each with its own character, its own enemies, its own specific horrors, and its own specific victories. In Akshi, the realm of fire, the Stormcast fought against the Khornate armies that had been entrenched there for centuries. Kragnos Kul and his endless bloodbound, mortals who had devoted their lives to the skull throne of the blood god, who measured their worth in the skulls of enemies collected and offered, were formidable opponents. The specific nature of Khornate combat, overwhelming, ferocious, caring nothing for casualties, because the blood god demands only that skulls be taken, with no particular preference for whose. Fighting an enemy that is strengthened rather than discouraged by taking losses requires a different approach than conventional warfare. The Stormcast also sought allies they had not had before. The Fire Slayers, the Dwarden who live in volcanic holes and mine the sacred Urgold that they believe contains fragments of their shattered god Grimnir, were in Akshi, and their specific combination of volcanic resilience and financial pragmatism made them useful partners. Fire Slayers fight for gold. This is not venality, it is theology, the specific belief that acquiring gold is a form of devotion to their shattered deity. The Stormcast paid in gold. The Fire Slayers fought. In Giran, the realm of life, the campaign was against Nurgle, and it was among the most important and most difficult of the Realmgate wars, and Nurgle had been methodically transforming Giran into an extension of his garden in the realm of chaos. What had been a realm of extraordinary natural beauty and teeming life was becoming something that combined both life and death in the specific way that Nurgle finds aesthetically satisfying, overflowing, decaying, feverish with the specific vitality of corruption. Nurgle is not simply a god of death. He is a god of a particular kind of life, the kind that blooms in rot and finds beauty in decay and sees no meaningful distinction between the living and the dying, because both are simply stages in the same process. Fighting Nurgle's forces in a realm he had been transforming for 5 centuries was fighting in his environment. The Stormcast who descended into Giran found battlefields that were both beautiful and diseased, and that were actively hostile in ways beyond simply having enemies on them. What changed the campaign was Alarielle. The Everqueen had been in hiding for most of the Age of Chaos, in her sanctuary of Athelwerd, the most sacred of her hidden valleys, protected by the specific magic of the natural world at its most concentrated. She had been diminished by centuries of watching Nurgle transform her realm, diminished by isolation, diminished by the specific grief of a goddess watching her domain be corrupted. The Stormcast who found her found someone who had retreated into a form of divine despair. Lord Celestant Gardus, one of the most remarkable of the early Stormcast, known for the specific compassion and faith he maintained through multiple reforgings, reached her. He had entered the Garden of Nurgle itself to retrieve what was needed for the campaign, and had survived it intact, a feat that should have been impossible, and that the lore treats as a demonstration of what genuine faith looks like when tested absolutely. The encounter with the Stormcast, and with Gardus' specific character, began Alarielle's recovery. Not immediately. She did not simply shake off centuries of diminishment and return to full divine power. She seeded herself, passing through a form of death and rebirth that her divine nature makes possible, and emerged renewed as the war goddess of spring, rather than simply the goddess of the natural world. Wrathful, powerful, with an enormous war beetle called Gearstrike as her mount, and the Sylvaneth, her tree spirit children, rallied around her. Nurgle did not take this well. The War of Life, the campaign in Giran, became defined by the renewed Alarielle's presence. The realm that had been slowly becoming Nurgle's garden began, in places, to reassert its own nature. the specific struggle between decay and renewal, between Nurgle's vision of abundant but corrupted life, and Alarielle's vision of natural life on its own terms, is one of the most cosmologically interesting conflicts in Age of Sigmar's history. Galmaraz and the recovery of Sigmar's hammer. One of the central objectives of the Realmgate Wars, beyond simply establishing order's presence in each realm, was the recovery of Galmaraz. Galmaraz is Sigmar's divine warhammer, the ancient weapon he had wielded since his mortal days as a barbarian king, the hammer whose name means skull splitter in the old tongue, the specific conduit through which much of Sigmar's divine power flows. It had been lost during the desperate final battles of the Age of Chaos, taken by the forces of Tzeentch and hidden somewhere in the realm of metal. Without Galmaraz, Sigmar was still a god, still formidable, still capable of everything he had done in Azyr during the long wait. But something was incomplete. A divine weapon that has been a part of a god's existence since before that existence was divine is not simply a tool. It is part of what the god is. The campaign to recover it involved the realm of Shamon, the realm of metal, where the landscape itself is alchemical, where rivers run with liquid mercury and mountains are made of pure ore, and the physics of metalwork applied to geography in ways that make simple travel more complex than it sounds. Tzeentch's forces in Shamon were among the most difficult to fight. The architect of fate, the chaos god of change and scheming, and the specific madness of too much possibility at once, whose followers are defined not by direct violence, but by manipulation, illusion, and the maddening quality of plans within plans. Fighting Tzeentchian forces is fighting an enemy who wants you to fight them on their terms, who is prepared for what you are going to do, who finds your confidence in your own strategy amusing because they have already accounted for it. The Stormcast Celestial Vindicators, the most vengeful of the storm hosts, led this campaign with the specific energy of warriors who have grievances to settle. Galmaraz was recovered. Sigmar, when he held it again, was restored to something closer to his full divine capacity. The moment of its return is described with the specific weight of a god reunited with a part of themselves they had not realized was missing until it was back. The cities of Sigmar. The Realmgate Wars were not only about military campaigns. They were about making the reclaimed territory worth defending, establishing settlements that mortals could actually live in, that could sustain themselves without requiring Stormcast presence indefinitely. The cities of Sigmar were the answer, built around secured realm gates, protected by Stormcast garrisons, but populated by the mortal survivors who had endured the Age of Chaos, and by refugees from Azyr who had spent generations there during the long wait. The cities of Sigmar became the foundation of what order in the mortal realms would look like. Hunhammerhal is the most significant. The twin-tailed city, built around a massive realm gate that straddles two realms simultaneously, with one half in Akshi and the other in Giran. A city that exists in two places at once, its populations divided by the portal at its center, connected across the boundary between a realm of fire and a realm of life. It is enormous. It is strategically essential. It is also a city in the way that all cities in the mortal realms tend to be, full of ambition and desperation, and the specific energy of people who know that the darkness is still out there and are building anyway. Other cities followed, The living city in Giran, built into an ancient forest whose trees Alariel's influence has made partially sentient. Excelsis, built around a mine of ether quartz, whose prophetic properties allow its inhabitants to see glimpses of possible futures. Greywater Fastness, the industrial city built on pragmatism and necessity, rather than divine inspiration. Each city was a foothold. Each foothold was contested. The chaos forces that had held the realms for 5 centuries did not simply stop existing when the Stormcast arrived. They retreated, adapted, and continued to fight. The cities of Sigmar were built in contested territory, defended against constant pressure, their populations always aware that the frontier was close and the frontier was not safe. The 8 Points and Archaon, the strategic goal of the Realmgate Wars. Beyond individual campaigns and individual reclamations was the 8 Points. The 8 Points is a nexus realm in the etheric void between the 8 mortal realms. It contains 8 massive archways, great portals connecting to each of the 8 realms simultaneously, which means that whoever controls the 8 Points controls the most important strategic position in the mortal realms. You can project force into any realm from the 8 Points. You can receive reinforcements from any realm into the 8 Points. It is the hub of the cosmic network. Archaon had controlled it since the Age of Chaos. His great fortress of the Varanspire dominated the 8 Points. A citadel built from the bones of the fallen, reinforced by the concentrated power of the Chaos Gods, defended by the most devoted and skilled of the Ever-Chosen's personal forces. The Stormcast fought for the 8 Points at the climax of the Realmgate Wars. They could not take it. Archaon's position was too strong, his forces too prepared, his specific combination of divine champion and military genius too formidable for even the Stormcast Eternals to overcome in a direct assault. The 8 Points remained in Chaos hands. It remains in Chaos hands. Archaon's fortress is still there, a constant strategic threat in the center of the mortal realms, the place that the forces of order have not been able to reach and which the forces of chaos use as both stronghold and training ground. The Realmgate Wars ended not with total victory, but with established footholds. Territories reclaimed, cities built. The balance of power shifted, but not transformed. Order had returned to the mortal realms. It had not yet won the mortal realms. The cost of reforging. Through all of this, the Stormcast Eternals had been dying and returning, the celestial cycle of death and reforging playing out across every battlefield of the Realmgate Wars. And the cost was becoming apparent. The first generation of Stormcast, the warriors who had been reforged earliest, who had fought the most campaigns, who had died the most times, were changing in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The specific quality of their presence was different. Where the newest Stormcast still carried the warm human texture of people who remembered their mortal lives, who had relationships and memories and the emotional range of beings who had recently been human. The veterans had something else, something quieter, something more distant. They still fought. They still followed orders. They still, in most cases, displayed the honor and courage and faith that had made Sigmar choose them. But the memories of who they had been before the anvil were fading. The connections that had made them people were becoming architecture, frameworks without content, shapes where meaning used to live. Some veterans of many reforgings were becoming something that was hard to call human in any meaningful sense. Still warriors, still devoted to Sigmar's cause, still present on the battlefield with the full force of their divine capability, but increasingly empty in the specific way that someone becomes empty when the person who lived inside them has been gradually replaced by the pattern of who they were without the substance. And this is the tragedy at the heart of the Stormcast Eternals. The army Sigmar built to save the mortal realms is an army that destroys itself through the process of saving them. Every death, every return to the anvil, every reforging takes something. The cost of immortality is paid in humanity. The warriors who fight longest lose the most of what made them worth fighting for. Sigmar knows this. He has sought solutions from every divine source available to him. None have been fully satisfactory. The war continues regardless. Sleep well. The realms are being rebuilt. The darkness has not retreated, but the lightning has not stopped falling. Welcome back. Let everything slow. Nagash's long plan. While the Realmgate wars were being fought, while the Stormcast Eternals descended on lightning and reclaimed territory and built the cities of Sigmar, Nagash was working. He is always working. The great necromancer's patience is geological. He thinks in millennia, he plans across centuries, and every action he takes is in service of a goal that he has never deviated from since his first mortal life. The goal, dominion over all souls. Every soul that has ever lived and died, every soul that currently lives, every soul that will ever live in the future. Nagash believes these are his. He is the god of death. Death is the one certainty that every mortal being shares. And what comes after death, in the mortal realms, should by rights be his to govern. The problem, other beings keep interfering with this. Sigmar's Stormcast Eternals were an offense to Nagash in ways that go beyond simple military conflict. When a Stormass dies, their soul is taken by Sigmar back to Azir to be reforged. In Nagash's theological framework, those souls belong to him. They pass through death, however briefly, and death means they entered his domain. Sigmar stealing them back is not simply a tactical maneuver. It is theft. Divine, ongoing, systematic theft of property that Nagash considers his by the fundamental nature of existence. He had been planning his response since the beginning of the Age of Sigmar. The plan was called the Necroquake, and it required decades of preparation that Nagash conducted in secret. Were working in the depths of Shyish, while the other factions were occupied with the Realmgate wars and their aftermath. The Great Black Pyramid, the realm of death, Shyish, has a specific property that Nagash had identified and exploited over centuries. Its geography reflects the concept of death. Death means endings. The further you travel from the center of Shyish, the closer you get to death in its most absolute form. The absolute center of Shyish, the deepest point, the most extreme expression of death as a principle, is a place of concentrated amethyst energy, raw death magic at its most powerful. Nagash spent decades collecting every piece of grave sand. The realm stone of Shyish solidified death magic in its most concentrated form. From across the realm, he built a massive pyramid at the absolute center of Shyish, using this grave sand. The Great Black Pyramid, an arcane structure of immense power, designed to channel and concentrate the death magic of the entire realm. The ritual he intended to perform, inverting the polarity of Shyish, reversing the flow of death magic from the edges of the realm toward its center, creating a catastrophic wave of amethyst energy that would flood every mortal realm simultaneously. The intent was specific, not simply to cause destruction, but to drown the realms in death magic so completely that Nagash could claim sovereignty over every soul in every realm at once. Every living thing would feel death pressing in from all directions. Every dead thing would rise, and Nagash would be there, at the center of it all, with his hand on everything. Other factions discovered what he was doing. They moved to stop him. There was a battle at Nagash's capital as the forces of order, chaos, and other powers rushed to interrupt the ritual. Nagash attempted to complete it before they could interfere. The Skaven interfered instead. The Necroquake. The Skaven, the rat men who worship the horned rat, and whose defining characteristic is that their ambitions always slightly exceed their competence, had their own reasons for wanting to disrupt whatever Nagash was doing. Their gnaw-hole tunnels riddled the underworlds of Shyish. Their agents had been watching. They sabotaged the ritual, not by stopping it, by corrupting it at a critical moment, by introducing the specific chaos of Skaven incompetence into an enormously complex magical working at the worst possible time. The Great Black Pyramid sank into the depths of Shyish, boring a void into the realm's heart, and the wave of death magic that Nagash had intended to control and direct instead exploded outward without direction. The Necroquake was not what Nagash planned. It was what happened when his plan was broken at the moment of execution. Instead of a controlled inversion of Shyiash's polarity that he could direct like a weapon, it was a catastrophic release of raw amethyst energy that swept across all the mortal realms simultaneously. The dead rose everywhere, not because Nagash told them to, because the Necroquake's energy touched every corpse and every anchored spirit in every realm, and activated them regardless of Nagash's specific intentions. Night-haunt processions erupted from the underworlds without commanders or purpose. An ancient dead rose from burial sites that had been undisturbed for centuries. The specific horror of the Necroquake's effect was that it was uncontrolled. Death magic that had been intended as a precision instrument became a flooding catastrophe that hit everyone, including Nagash's own forces. The nature of magic in the mortal realms changed. Spells that should dissipate after casting began to sustain themselves. The specific quality of the death magic wave giving magical workings an indefinite lifespan. These became known as endless spells, autonomous magical constructs with their own behaviors, roaming the realms, dangerous and unpredictable. Nagash was furious and pragmatic. The Necroquake had not achieved what he intended, but it had achieved something. It had dramatically increased the power of death magic across all realms. It had raised enormous forces of Night-haunt that he could now work to organize and direct, and it had disrupted the plans of every other faction simultaneously. He began working with what he had. The Soul Wars. The conflict that followed the Necroquake is called the Soul Wars, and it defined the Age of Sigmar's second major narrative era. Nagash organized the Night-haunt, the the spectral processions of spirits that the Necroquake had raised into a functioning military force. This required a commander of specific quality, someone who understood fear, who could direct the psychological warfare that Nighthaunt armies excel at, who had the ambition and the ruthlessness that leading Nagash's vanguard required. He found her in the ruins of Dolorum. Lady Olinda was, in mortal life, a schemer of extraordinary skill. She had maneuvered herself through the noble courts of her realm, through manipulation, charm, and the strategic deployment of visible grief. Her betrothed and his father had died mysteriously on her wedding night, leaving her to rule alone. She wore her mourning veil for the rest of her mortal life. Nagash, who appreciates irony, gave her in death the grief she had only performed in life. He cursed her to feel all the genuine sorrow and anguish of the mortal realm simultaneously, making her the living, or rather spectral, embodiment of authentic grief. She is the Mortic of grief, the mourning bride, the unrequited queen. She commands the Nighthaunt processions in Nagash's name, and her presence is a weapon. Those who come near her are overwhelmed by waves of supernatural despair so heavy that the will to fight dissolves. Cities fell not because their walls were breached, but because their defenders looked at Lady Olinda and could not remember why survival mattered. There is a specific detail about her that captures something essential. She wears a veil, and occasionally, in battle, she lifts it. Those who look at what is beneath the veil do not survive to describe it. Whether what she shows them is the full weight of death's grief made visible, or something more personal, or simply the face of complete despair, the lore does not specify. No one who has seen it has been able to tell anyone what they saw. The Stormcast response. The Necroquake presented the Stormcast Eternals with a specific problem. Their conventional combat capabilities were not well suited to fighting Nighthaunt. Ethereal entities pass through ordinary matter. Ordinary weapons pass through them. The spectral host required magical weapons, blessed armaments, or specifically enchanted means to damage them. Entire armies that relied primarily on conventional weapons found themselves useless against the flooding processions of the dead. Sigmar's response was to unlock a chamber of Stormcast that had been sealed since the beginning of the Realmgate Wars, the Sacrosanct Chamber. These were Stormcast, whose specialization was in soulcraft and magical warfare, battle wizards and soulbinders, and those whose reforging had given them specific attunement to the interaction between the physical and the spiritual. They had been held in reserve for exactly this kind of situation. The Sacrosanct Chamber's deployment marked the beginning of Order's organized response to the Soul Wars. They were also discovering something about the Necroquake's effect on the reforging process. The disruption of soul paths by the wave of death magic meant that Stormcast souls killed in battle were taking longer to return to Azir. Some were losing more with each reforging cycle than before. The specific crisis of the Soul Wars included the awareness that Nagash's attack on the Stormcast was not only military but existential. He was attacking the very process that made them what they were. The war's shape. The Soul Wars were fought across all the mortal realms simultaneously, with death forces attacking cities and strongholds that had been built during the Realmgate Wars. The free cities, the cities of Sigmar that represented Order's foothold in the reclaimed territories, were primary targets. Nagash's logic was specific. The Stormcast Eternals were taking souls from him by reforging. The best way to stop this was to destroy the infrastructure of order in the mortal realms, reduce the number of mortals living under Sigmar's protection, and accumulate so many souls simultaneously through the Soul War's casualties that his own power increased faster than Sigmar's. The Soul Wars also saw the emergence of Nagash's most disciplined forces, the Ossiarch Boner Reapers, where the Nighthaunt were chaotic, emotional, organized around the psychological weapon of fear and grief. The Ossiarch Boner Reapers were something different entirely. They were constructed from the bones of the dead, built rather than raised, and assembled with the specific precision of Nagash's most devoted architect, a being called Orpheon Catacross, the Mortarch of the Necropolis, who had been a legendary general in the mortal life, and retained his military genius in his constructed undead form. The Bone Reapers operated the Bone Tithe, a systematic tax levied on mortal populations, requiring them to contribute bones, their own, their dead relatives, anyone's bones, to Nagash's collection. Those who refused found the tithe collected from them anyway. The Ossiarch Boner Reapers were the enforcement mechanism. They were not random violence. They were systematic extraction, civilized in their structure and horrifying in their content. An undead army organized not around battle frenzy or spectral terror, but around logistics and supply chain management. Key, the revelations of the Soul Wars. The Soul Wars forced several important revelations across the factions of the mortal realms. The Stormcast Eternals confronted their own mortality in a new way. They had known, abstractly, that reforging was costing them something. The Soul Wars made this viscerally clear. They were watching their comrades change, watching veterans of many reforgings become distant and strange, watching the army that Sigmar had built to save the mortal realms slowly lose what had made it human. The question of whether this was acceptable, whether an army of increasingly inhuman warriors in service of divine order was preferable to defeat, was one that individual Stormcast began to grapple with directly rather than abstractly. Nagash's position. He was not wrong. The Stormcast are taking souls from him. By the fundamental theology of the mortal realms, Nagash has a legitimate claim to the souls of those who die. Sigmar's reforging process is, from Nagash's perspective, a divine crime that he has been tolerating longer than his patience normally extends. Whether Nagash being technically correct about soul ownership means that his specific response, attempting to drown all the mortal realms in death magic and claim sovereignty over every living and dead thing simultaneously, is justified, is the kind of question that the Age of Sigmar presents without providing an answer. Eventually, the Soul Wars ended, not through decisive military victory, but through the disruption of Nagash's plans by other forces, through the resilience of the free cities, and through the eventual intervention of Alariel performing a ritual that saturated the mortal realms with life magic, effectively pushing back against the Necroquake's death magic saturation. Nagash retreated to rebuild. The Nighthaunt continued their processions without his direct guidance. The dead were still raised across the realms, still present, still dangerous. The Soul Wars had not resolved the fundamental conflict between the divine claim of Nagash and the divine project of Sigmar. That conflict has not been resolved. It continues, as most things in the mortal realms continue. Beneath the surface, in the cold places between battles, where the dead wait for the living to eventually join them. Sleep well. The darkness of Shyish is deep, but the light of Azir has not gone out. Welcome back. Let everything slow. What came before? The mortal realms, by the time of the Broken Realms narrative series, were not the same as they had been when the Realmgate Wars began. The Stormcast Eternals had established footholds. The cities of Sigmar had been built and were growing. Alariel had been restored. Nagash's Necroquake had disrupted everything and then been disrupted itself. But the pattern that emerges from the Age of Sigmar's history, the pattern that the Broken Realms series makes explicit, is that stability in the mortal realms is always temporary. Every alliance eventually fractures. Every divine being has an agenda. Every apparent victory creates a new vulnerability. The Broken Realms events make very clear that the question the Age of Sigmar is asking is not whether order will defeat chaos. It is whether the fractious, complicated, mutually suspicious beings on all sides, gods who scheme against each other, mortals who want things that conflict with each other's wants, ancient grudges and betrayals that stretch back to the old world, can maintain enough coherence to prevent something worse than chaos from consuming everything? The answer is not reassuring. Morathi and the hunger for godhood. Morathi is one of the most fascinating figures in Age of Sigmar lore, and that is a significant claim in a setting populated by gods, ancient monsters, and beings of divine power who have been scheming for millennia. She is the mother of Malerion, who was Malekith the Witch King in the old world, now transformed into the shadowy god Malerion in the mortal realms. She survived the destruction of the old world. She survived her time within Slanesh's divine belly during the end times, devoured along with the other elven souls, existing inside a chaos god for a period, emerging changed in ways that she has spent the entire Age of Sigmar concealing. Her true form, after her time inside Slanesh, is monstrous, half elf in her upper body, half enormous serpent below. She conceals this from her followers, the daughters of Cain, the blood-hungry elven warrior priestesses who worship the war god Cain. Through powerful illusion magic, presenting herself as the graceful high oracle she appears to be, her followers believe they worship Cain. The truth is that Morathi has absorbed Cain's divine essence and is herself the source of the divine power they channel. She wants to be a god, and not in the sense that she wants to be worshipped. She already is, in the sense that she wants divine invulnerability, divine permanence, the specific quality of existence that means she cannot be destroyed by anything the mortal realms might produce. She has been working toward this since the Age of Myth. The Broken Realms series is the story of how she achieved it, what she needed, elven souls of sufficient divine power to fuel the ritual of apotheosis. Where those souls were, still inside Slanesh, not yet recovered by the elven god's slow extraction project. Her plan: enter Slanesh's divine essence directly, consume enough souls to achieve godhood from the inside. The artifacts she collected to make this possible took years to acquire. The Varanite, a rare and extraordinarily dangerous form of realm stone, the solid essence of chaos itself, to provide the fuel. The Okarian Lantern, an artifact created by Teclis to extract Elven souls from Slaanesh, stolen by the Edeneth Deepkin when Teclis attempted to destroy them and hidden in the deep ocean. Morathi hired pirates. She stole from gods. She manipulated Sigmar into cooperating with her by making herself temporarily useful against Archon. She performed the ritual. She entered Slaanesh's belly. She consumed the most powerful elven souls she could find. Souls of ancient elven kings, beings of immense divine weight accumulated from a civilization that had lasted thousands of years. She was becoming divine inside the body of a chaos god through the specific violence of consumption. Then she met the soul of Enarion. Enarion was the first Phoenix King, the greatest warrior in the history of the Elven people, the one who had saved them in the earliest ages of the Old World by drawing the sword that no one should draw and paying the price for it. Morathi had loved him once. He was the father of Malerion. He cut her in half. Not literally, not in any simple physical sense, but the specific force of the greatest elven soul striking back against the being who had come to consume him, ruptured the ritual at its critical moment, severed the connection between Morathi inside Slaanesh and Morathi's physical body outside, and ejected her back into the mortal realms. With a permanent consequence, she had achieved godhood, but not cleanly. Her soul had been split. Two physical bodies now exist, sharing one divine soul. Morathi Kane, the graceful aspect, the high oracle and general, and the Shadow Queen, the full serpentine monstrous form that she had been hiding, the dark half of her nature made autonomous. Two bodies, one soul, one divine existence divided, and one more consequence. Something came through the portal with her when she was ejected. Something small, something that had been growing inside Slaanesh, alongside the imprisoned elven souls. Something that flew away from the site of the ritual like a comet and found a distant place to rest and grow. The newborn, a fragment of Slaanesh, born from the god's imprisonment, carrying something of the Dark Prince's nature without being the Dark Prince. A new entity, unprecedented, whose existence will have consequences that are still unfolding. Teclis and the punishment of Nagash. While Morathi was pursuing godhood, Nagash was pursuing his own agenda, invading Hysh, the realm of light, which had been largely outside his reach during the Soul Wars. Teclis, whose realm Hysh is, was not pleased. Teclis is the greatest wizard in the mortal realms, in either the mortal realms or the old world that preceded them. He is precise, analytical, and possessed of the specific arrogance that comes from being genuinely the most capable practitioner of magic in the known universe. He's also genuinely dedicated to the well-being of the Elven people and to the project of rebuilding Elven civilization in the mortal realms, creating the Lumineth Realm Lords from the recovered Elven souls extracted from Slaanesh, building a civilization organized around the principles of enlightenment and the light of Hysh. Nagash attacking Hysh after everything the great necromancer had done during the Soul Wars was one problem too many. Teclis responded with precision. He did not simply defend Hysh, he invaded Shyish, the realm of death, with a Lumineth army, fighting deep into Nagash's domain. The goal was not a military conquest of the realm of death. Even Teclis at his most confident, could not expect to permanently hold territory in Nagash's own realm. The goal was a demonstration that Nagash could be hurt, that his forces could be pushed back, that the people of Shuish, who had been living under his dominion, could see that the great necromancer was not invincible. The campaign climaxed in a direct confrontation. Teclis destroyed the 9 books of Nagash, ancient artifacts that were the primary source of the great necromancer's most powerful spell casting. Arkan the Black, Nagash's most loyal lieutenant and a figure who had served him since the old world, was destroyed so completely that recovery was essentially impossible for the foreseeable future. Hurled from the edge of a realm into the void, Nagash himself was defeated and sealed within his palace in Shyish, his direct power constrained for a time. The Necroquake, the wave of death magic that had defined the Soul Wars, was ended. These were significant victories. They were also limited. Nagash would recover. His palace would not hold him forever. The realm of death would not become a realm of order simply because Teclis had fought through it. But the message had been sent. The god of death could bleed. The Soul Wars had an end, and Teclis had ended them. Be'lakor and the Cursed Skies. There is a being older than Archaon in the service of chaos, and he is not pleased about Archaon. Be'lakor is the Dark Master, the first demon prince, the entity that predates the current champions of chaos by ages, who was promised dominion over the world when he served the chaos gods faithfully, and then watched that dominion given to Archaon instead. He has been nursing this grievance for millennia. He is powerful, ancient, highly intelligent, and entirely consumed by the specific resentment of someone who was promised something and then wasn't given it. His project during the Broken Realms was to disrupt the balance of power in the mortal realms in ways that would serve his own interests, which are, broadly, to be the one in charge rather than permanently second to Archaon. For he was not fighting for order, for death, for destruction, or for chaos in any loyal sense. He was fighting for Be'lakor. What he developed, a way to corrupt the Realmgates, severing specific realms from Azir and redirecting the connection to chaos instead. The specific effect that made this interesting, when Stormcast Eternals were killed in areas affected by this corruption, their souls could not return to Azir to be reforged. They went to Nagash, who, despite his diminished state, could use Stormcast soul juice effectively enough to be dangerous. He formed an alliance with Lady Olinda, an unlikely partnership, Demon Prince and Morturk of Grief, united by the specific circumstance of both wanting things that temporarily aligned. Be'lakor's disruption of the Realmgates gave him power. Olinda's participation gave him forces she commanded. He threatened her mortal remains, the physical body she had left behind when she became a ghost, to ensure her cooperation. The Cursed Skies, as this disruption became known, created a period of genuine crisis for the Stormcast Eternals. Their immortality was being weaponized against them, their souls sent to Nagash rather than back to Azir. The specific nightmare of an army that cannot die, discovering that it might be able to die after all, die permanently, their souls claimed by the great necromancer, was not simply tactical, it was existential. The crisis was eventually resolved through the intervention of Grungni, the Dwarden god of smiths, who had been in self-imposed exile I had returned to the mortal realms in secret and had been working quietly to address various problems, including the reforging flaw. His intervention drove Be'lakor back and restored the connections that the cursed skies had severed. But the knowledge remained. The Stormcast Eternals' immortality had a vulnerability. Nagash knew where it was. Be'lakor had found it. Whatever came next would have this information available. The shape of things. The Broken Realms events left the mortal realms in a specific state. A new god existed, Morathi Kane, divine but fractured, the most powerful being in the Grand Alliance of Order after Sigmar himself, and not reliably loyal to anyone but herself. The soul wars were over, but the dead were still rising. Nagash was temporarily contained but not defeated. Be'lakor had demonstrated that the Stormcast Eternals were not invulnerable. Slaanesh was still imprisoned, but the newborn was growing somewhere in the mortal realms. A fragment of Slaanesh's divine essence, free for the first time, carrying the Dark Prince's nature without the Dark Prince's full power. The Grand Alliance of Chaos was not unified. Archaon held the 8 points and maintained his position as the Ever-Chosen. But Be'lakor's independent action and the various Chaos God factions pursuing their own agendas without coordinating with the Ever-Chosen meant that Chaos was as fractious as Order in its own way. The forces of destruction, the Greenskins and Ogors and Gargants, who acknowledge Gorkamorka's general authority while doing mostly whatever they want, were building towards something in Gore, the realm of beasts, and beneath the surface, something old was stirring, something that had been imprisoned since the Age of Myth, that predated even the Chaos God's current dominion over parts of the mortal realms, that remembered the world before Sigmar came, and was not particularly pleased with what he had built. Kragnos was waking up. Sleep well. The era of the beast is approaching, and in the realm of beasts, everything is always hungry. Welcome back. Let everything slow. Kragnos wakes. When Alarielle performed her rite of life, the ritual that saturated the mortal realms with life magic, pushing back the Necroquake's death saturation and ending the soul wars, she was not thinking about what was buried in a mountain in Gore. She should have been. The rite of life sent powerful currents of life magic through every realm simultaneously. In Gore, the realm of beasts, where life expresses itself as predation and strength and the specific vitality of things that have never known civilization. The life magic flooded ancient stone and ancient prison alike, seeping into a sealed mountain that had held something extraordinary for the entire age of myth and everything that followed. It seeped into Kragnos, and it gave him enough vitality to break out. The stone shattered, the mountain cracked from within, and Kragnos, the god of earthquakes and upheaval, who had been imprisoned since before the Age of Chaos, who was the last surviving member of a mortal race called the Drogrug, that had been nearly extinguished in a war against the Draconith long ago, walked back into the mortal realms for the first time in millennia. He was not peaceful about this. Kragnos, the end of empires. To understand what Kragnos represents in the lore of Age of Sigmar, it helps to understand what he was before his imprisonment. The Drogrug were a centauroid people, horse-bodied below, humanoid and powerful above, a race of natural warriors who had flourished in the primal wilderness of Gur. During the Age of Myth, a Kragnos had risen among them, not simply as a great warrior, but as something approaching divine. The Oryx who witnessed his power in the early days of his ascension began to call him the Boss Trampler, and the stories they told of him grew more impressive with each retelling. As stories about powerful beings in Warhammer often do, the growing faith made Kragnos genuinely more powerful. He was the end of empires. His specific gift, the reason the name attached to him, was that where he marched, civilizations ended, not armies defeated, not cities sacked, empires ended. The specific scale of destruction that Kragnos' presence enabled was not simply military, it was cosmic. The earth opened, walls crumbled. The careful structures that mortal beings build to organize their lives against the chaos of the natural world dissolved before him, and he had been imprisoned by Lord Croak, the ancient Seraphon Slan mage priest, one of the oldest beings in the mortal realms, whose divine power was sufficient to seal the god of earthquakes inside a mountain, until Alariel's life magic undid the prison accidentally. When he returned to the mortal realms, he found that his people were gone. The Drogruk nation of Dons, his homeland, was ruins consumed by Gur's expanding wilderness. The race he had been king of existed only as rumor, possibly as a few survivors hidden somewhere in the realm. He saw the gleaming spires of Excelsis on the horizon, a city of Sigmar, built on what had been his homeland's territory. He considered this an affront. He marched. The Siege of Excelsis. Excelsis had already been having a difficult time when Kragnos began his approach, and the city had a Skaven infestation. A cult of Slaanesh had been operating inside it, abducting and sacrificing elves to bring the newborn. That fragment of Slaanesh's essence that had escaped through Morathi's ritual into partial manifestation. The knights Excelsior Stormers had been conducting a brutal campaign against both threats with the specific lack of mercy that is their defining characteristic. Kragnos arrived with hundreds of thousands of greenskins following in his wake. The specific attraction of a god of destruction who embodies the primal violent potential that all greenskins worship is not easily overestimated. Gordrak, the Fist of Gork, the most powerful Ironjaw's Orc warchief alive, came to challenge Kragnos for dominance. They fought. Kragnos won. Gordrak, in the specific logic of greenskin culture, where winning proves you are worth following, became part of the War. The siege that followed was one of the largest assaults on a city of Sigmar in the Age of Sigmar's history. Excelsis came close to falling. It was saved through the simultaneous arrival of Morathi Kane and Lord Croak, who recognized that Kragnos needed to be removed from the equation rather than defeated conventionally. They tricked him into entering a portal that he believed would take him to the Draconith, the race he hated most, whose ancestors had nearly destroyed his people. Instead, it transported him away from Excelsis, stranding him elsewhere in Gur. The city survived. Kragnos, enraged, went looking for the next fight. The Era of the Beast, Gur Awakens. The release of Kragnos defined the third edition of Age of Sigmar's narrative, the Era of the Beast, because his presence in the mortal realms did something that went beyond simple military threat. He awakened something in Gur itself. Gur, the realm of beasts, is not simply a place where predators live. It It is a realm organized around the principle of predation. The landscape is alive in specific ways. The terrain hunts, rock formations shift to trap prey, rivers hide what lives in them. Everything in Gore exists in predator-prey relationships, including the civilizations that have tried to build there. Kragnos' return amplified this quality. The energy that greenskins generate, the specific magical force of their collective violence, which exists in the lore as a genuine spiritual phenomenon, reached unprecedented levels as hundreds of thousands of greenskins answered the call of the god they had been venerating for ages without knowing he existed. The realm of beasts responded to this energy by becoming more itself, more predatory, more hostile to the careful, ordered structures that civilization tries to impose on the wild. Excelsis survived the siege. It did not recover easily. The cities of order in Gore found themselves fighting not just against greenskin armies, but against a realm that had been reinvigorated in ways that made it less willing to tolerate their presence. The Stormcast Eternals received new equipment for this new environment. Grungni, the Duarden god of smiths, who had returned from his self-imposed exile, who had been working on improvements to the reforging process and to Stormcast armament. The Thunderstrike armor, lighter, more flexible than the earlier Stormcast plate, designed for the specific challenges of fighting in Gore, equipped the newest chambers of Stormcast Eternals. The Draconith, ancient draconic beings who had survived the war that nearly destroyed Kragnos' people, renewed their alliance with Sigmar. Kragnos was their ancient enemy, and the enemy of their enemy was a useful ally regardless of the complicated history between Draconith and Stormcast. The Dawnbringer Crusades. The era of the beast was not simply a period of defensive crisis. It was also the period in which Sigmar launched one of his most ambitious projects, the Dawnbringer Crusades. The Crusades were great caravans of mortal settlers, engineers, priests, and Stormcast escorts, launched from existing cities of Sigmar into the hostile territory beyond their walls, with the explicit goal of founding new cities. Not just military outposts, cities. Permanent settlements capable of sustaining mortal populations, with walls and markets, and the specific infrastructure of civilization, rather than simply garrison posts. This was ambitious in a way that required acknowledging something about the Stormcast Eternals that the previous campaigns had not fully confronted. They were not builders. They were extraordinary warriors, but the presence of Stormcast armies in an area was not sufficient to create civilization. What creates civilization is people who live there, who invest in it, who build lives in it, who care about its continuation beyond the next battle. The Dawnbringer Crusades brought those people into hostile territory under Stormcast protection and gave them what they needed to begin building. Many of the Crusades failed. The casualty rates among the mortal settlers were significant. Some of the cities they founded were subsequently destroyed by the threats that the era of the beast had amplified. The survivors of failed crusades often became the most hardened fighters in the mortal armies of order, carrying the specific grit of people who had watched everything they built be torn down and had decided to build it again anyway. The twin-tailed crusade, the most significant of these expeditions, launched from Hammerhall and wound through both Akshi and Giran, fighting through extraordinary dangers suffering significant losses, and establishing strong points that would define the frontier of Order's expansion. The Hour of Ruin. The Skaven had been planning something. The Skaven are always planning something. The specific character of Skaven civilization, hierarchical but chaotic, driven by ambition that always slightly exceeds competence, organized around the specific urgency of a species that breeds fast and thinks in short-term advantages, means that they are always, at some level, building toward catastrophe. The Vermin Doom was the culmination of a plan that the great clans of the Under Empire had been working toward for centuries. The activation of colossal warp drills positioned at key points across the mortal realms. Poison nexus points that maintained the cosmic balance between the 8 realms. When the drills activated simultaneously, and they forced the mortal realms out of their cosmic alignment, the effect was catastrophic. Blight City, the vast mobile capital of Skaven civilization, a city that exists in a pocket dimension accessed through gnaw-holes, smashed through the weakened boundaries of reality into Akshi, the realm of fire, in an explosion that transformed the surrounding land into a corrupted wasteland called the Gnaw. Similar corruptions appeared elsewhere across the realms, wherever the cosmic alignment had been disrupted. Pockets of pollution, reality wounds, places where the specific laws of nature had been twisted by the proximity of Skaven chaos. The great horned rat, the god of the Skaven, who had been a chaos god in practice if not in formal standing since he ascended during the end times, now formally joined the Pantheon of ruinous powers as its 5th member. The 4 original chaos gods and the great horned rat, 5 divine entities of destruction and change and death and excess, and now the specific divine power of corruption from within, of civilization eating itself. The hour of ruin had arrived, and with it came Skaven in numbers that had not been seen since the old world ended. Sigmar's response, the Ruination Chambers. Stormcast Eternals, who had undergone so many reforgings that they were no longer fully recognizable as the people they had been. Warriors so far along the process of losing their humanity that they were, in many practical senses, simply the distilled essence of what Sigmar needed them to be, rather than the complete persons they had started as. They were not broken, but they were changed, in ways that made them both more formidable and more tragic than the earlier Stormcast generations. Sigmar deployed them because the Hour of Ruin required everything that was available. The hardened veterans of too many deaths, the warriors who had lost the most, and therefore, in some specific way, had the least left to lose. The armies that had been forged through the Soul Wars and the era of the Beast and the Dawnbringer Crusades, and had survived all of it by sacrificing something of themselves in each campaign. Against Skaven in their billions, with demonic hosts reinforcing the Skaven advance, with cities falling across every realm simultaneously, with the cosmic alignment of the mortal realms disrupted by the Vermin Doom. Sigmar deployed his most damaged warriors. They held, not everywhere, not without losses that were difficult to account. Cities fell that had been defended through every crisis of the Age of Sigmar. Populations were lost. The frontier of order contracted in some realms as it was extended in others. The Dawnbringer Crusades continued because the specific stubbornness of the project, the the refusal to stop building even when what you have built is being torn down, is one of the defining characteristics of mortal civilization in the mortal realms. And the Age of Sigmar continued, as it always continues, not with victory, not with defeat, but with the specific quality of continuation that defines civilizations that refuse to accept the alternative. Sleep well. The war continues. The lightning still falls. And somewhere in the darkness of Shyish, Nagash is already planning his next move. Welcome back. Let everything slow. The shape of the conflict. The mortal realms are not a simple story of good versus evil. If there is one thing that the history we have covered makes clear, it is that every faction in Age of Sigmar has motivations that are internally coherent, agendas that extend beyond simple villainy or heroism, and relationships with the other factions that are complicated by history, grievance, and the specific dynamics of beings who have been fighting the same wars for centuries. Tonight, let us step back from the timeline and look at the four grand alliances, the organizing framework of the conflict, and understand each one on its own terms. Order, the alliance of building. The grand alliance of order is not held together by shared values. It is held together by the shared project of building things. Cities, civilizations, the specific infrastructure of life organized to resist the entropy that everything else in the mortal realms is trying to produce. Sigmar leads it, in the sense that the God King is the most powerful figure within it, and the one whose resources, the Stormcast Eternals, the cities built around Azir's gates, give order its military backbone. But Sigmar does not control the Grand Alliance of Order. He cannot dictate to Alarielle what happens in her realm. He cannot compel the Caradron overlords, the sky-faring Duardan merchants who travel between realms in their airships and trade with whoever can pay, to fight wars that don't profit them. He can ask the Fire Slayers for help, and they may agree if the gold is right. The Stormcast Eternals are Order's divine warriors, reforged mortal souls in Sigmarite armor, descending on lightning, capable of returning from death in ways that redefine what an army can sustain. They are also, increasingly, warriors who are losing something with each return. The Ruination Chambers, the veterans of too many reforgings, represent both Order's greatest military resource and its most troubling truth, that the process of saving the mortal realms is costing the savers their humanity one death at a time. The cities of Sigmar are where most of Order's mortal population lives, great urban centers built around secured Realmgates, diverse in their populations, human, elf, Duardin, and stranger beings, defended by standing armies and Stormcast garrisons. They are also, as the Dawnbringer Crusades are discovering, a finite in their security. Cities that survived the Age of Chaos and the Soul Wars and the era of the Beast have sometimes fallen to the hour of ruin. The Daughters of Cain, Morathi Cain's warrior priestesses, are technically within the Grand Alliance of Order, which makes the political dynamics of Order considerably more complicated. Morathi is a goddess now. She achieved godhood through betrayal and manipulation, and is loyal primarily to herself. Having her inside the Order coalition means having an entity who will cooperate when cooperation serves her interests, and act unilaterally when it does not. The Lumineth Realm Lords, Teclis's elven civilization, built on the principles of enlightenment and elemental harmony, are powerful but insular, and the Edeneth Deepkin, the sea elves who live in hidden enclaves and raid the surface world for souls to sustain their existence, are allies of convenience at best. The Sylvaneth, Alariel's tree spirit children, protect the natural world and will fight alongside other Order forces when the natural world is threatened, but their priorities are not the same as those of the cities of Sigmar. Order is a coalition of beings who agree that things should be built and not simply destroyed. Beyond that, the disagreements are substantial. Chaos, the alliance of unmaking. The Grand Alliance of Chaos is unified by worship of divine powers that want the mortal realms to reflect their own natures. And those natures do not coexist without conflict. Khorne is the god of blood and violence, of strength and skulls, of the specific purity of martial excellence pursued to its extreme. His followers fight because fighting is the point. Every skull taken is an offering. Every worthy opponent defeated is a devotion. Khorne cares nothing for sorcery. His specific contempt for magic means that Tzeentch's followers are almost as much his enemies as the forces of order. Tzeentch is the architect of fate, the god of change and scheming, and the specific madness of infinite possibility. He is plotting at all times, and his plots contain other plots, and no single outcome that he works toward is the only outcome he is working toward. His followers, the disciples of Tzeentch, are sorcerers and changers of forms, beings who embrace transformation as both theology and lifestyle. Tzeentch does not want chaos to simply win. He wants the game to continue because the game is the point. Nurgle is the plague god, the lord of all things, the being whose specific philosophy holds that decay and growth are the same process viewed from different angles. His followers find comfort in his embrace, not the comfort of safety, but the comfort of a deity who genuinely loves his followers in the specific way that someone who turns everything into part of their garden loves the garden. Nurgle's armies are slow, resilient, and disgusting. They are also, in the law's treatment, not entirely without pathos. The beings who serve Nurgle often genuinely believe in what they are doing. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, is currently imprisoned, but the Hedonites of Slaanesh continue their devotions regardless. The newborn, the fragment of Slaanesh that escaped through Morathi's ritual, is growing somewhere in the mortal realms, and the chains in Ulgish that hold Slaanesh have weakened with time. With each soul extracted, and with the broader disruptions of the Age of Sigmar, whether Slaanesh's full release is inevitable or simply possible is one of the outstanding questions the lore is building toward. The Great Horned Rat, newest member of the Pantheon of Ruinous Powers, brings the Skaven as his divine instrument, and the Skaven are a specific kind of problem. Not simply numerous, though they are extraordinarily numerous, but organized in the specific chaotic way that a civilization built entirely around hierarchy, ambition, and the willingness to backstab anyone above you produces. Skaven are brilliant and incompetent simultaneously, and capable of producing extraordinary technology and then deploying it in ways that fail spectacularly. The Vermindoom succeeded despite this, or perhaps because of it. The catastrophe was so large that even Skaven incompetence couldn't stop it. Archaon holds the Grand Alliance of Chaos together through force of personality, military genius, and the specific authority of being the Ever-Chosen, the champion chosen by all four original Chaos gods simultaneously, which gives him a legitimacy that no individual Chaos champion could claim. He does not love the Chaos gods. He resents them. He fights for a Chaos victory, not because he believes in what Chaos stands for, but because the alternative, a world where Sigmar wins, is the specific outcome that a man who prayed at the statue of Sigmar and received silence cannot accept. He is the most dangerous being in the mortal realms, not because he is the most powerful, Nagash would dispute this, but because he is the most strategically capable and the most consistently motivated. He has been pursuing the same goal across multiple worlds and ages. He does not stop. The Hellsmiths of Hashut represent the newest addition to the Grand Alliance of Chaos. Duardin, who served the Father of Darkness. Hashut, the eldest of the Duardin ancestor gods, whose betrayal by his siblings in the Age of Myth sent him into chaos, and whose followers have been biding their time in hidden holds for centuries. The hour of ruin forced them into the open, accelerating plans that had been moving slowly. Industrialized, slaveholding, and organized around the specific aesthetics of dark forges and demon-bound war machines, they are a new threat whose full capabilities the forces of order are still discovering. Death, the alliance of inevitability. Nagash does not think of death as a tragedy. He thinks of it as a destination that every mortal is eventually going to reach, and he believes he should be the one waiting when they arrive. The Grand Alliance of Death is organized around this premise. Every being that has ever died in the mortal realms belongs, by the theological logic of Nagash's domain, to him. The living are simply the dead who have not arrived yet. His forces are varied. The Night Haunt, the spectral processions of Lady Olinda and her kind, are fear made physical. Armies of the tortured dead who project supernatural despair. The Ossiarch Bone Reapers are the disciplined expression of Nagash's military philosophy. Constructed from the bones of the dead, organized around logistics and the bone tithe, commanded by Catacross, with the specific genius of a general who has never stopped learning. The Soulblight Gravelords are the Vampire Lords and their armies, ancient, powerful undead who serve Nagash because they must, and who pursue their own considerable ambitions within that service. The Flesh-Eater Courts are the tragic footnote. Ghouls who believe, through the specific delusion that Usharan's madness has spread to them, that they are noble knights. They fight their wars believing themselves to be heroes while behaving as monsters. Nagash himself is temporarily contained, sealed in his palace in Shyish, his direct power limited by Teclis's campaign. But sealed is not destroyed. The great necromancer has recovered from worse. He is planning the next move, as he is always planning the next move, with the specific patience of a being who has been making long-term plans since the age of mortal kings in the old world. Destruction, the alliance of primal force. The Grand Alliance of Destruction is not an alliance in any meaningful organizational sense. It is a category, a collection of beings who share the quality of not accepting the organized structures that civilization tries to impose on the natural world. Gorka Morka's followers, the Iron Jaws, the Krulaboys, the Bone Splitters, the Gloomspite Geats, are various expressions of the Orruk and Grot and Troggoth peoples organized around the divine energy of the War. The War is not simply a battle cry. It is a genuine spiritual phenomenon. The collective violent enthusiasm of greenskins generating a magical field that strengthens them as the excitement of the fight grows. An Orruk engaged in a great War is literally more powerful than the same Orruk sitting quietly, because the collective belief and passion of thousands of greenskins is adding divine energy to every swing of every weapon. The Ogre Moor tribes, the great hulking ogres who travel the realms in pursuit of food, are destruction in the most literal sense. They eat what they find and move on to find more. The sons of Behemoth, the Gargants, enormous humanoid beings of mountainous scale, simply go where they want and crush what is in the way. Kragnos, trapped now in Giran in a prison of Seraphon legions, represents the most powerful concentrated expression of destruction's divine nature. The god who ends empires, whose presence makes civilization feel fragile in the way that a mountain feels fragile in an earthquake. Destruction is the alliance that is not trying to build anything or unmake anything in any philosophical sense. It is simply the alliance of things that are bigger than you and don't particularly care that you build that wall. What all four want. Order wants to maintain and expand civilization. Chaos wants to unmake it in favor of something that reflects the chaos god's natures. Death wants to claim everything for Nagash's kingdom of the dead. Destruction wants to fight and eat and break things, because these are intrinsically satisfying activities. These four motivations are not equal in their cosmic weight. Order and chaos have the most investment in the mortal realms as they currently exist. One trying to build them, one trying to transform them. Death has the longest view. Nagash will inherit eventually, because everything dies eventually. Destruction is the most honest. It does not claim to have a plan for after. What makes Age of Sigmar interesting as a setting is that all four of these motivations are presented as comprehensible. Not all of them are presented as good. Chaos is not presented as good. But the beings who pursue these motivations have reasons for pursuing them that emerge from their histories and their natures, and the specific circumstances the mortal realms have produced. The war is not simple. The factions are not simple. And it is not over. Sleep well. One final part remains. What Age of Sigmar means, and where it is going. Welcome back. This is the final part. Let everything slow. We are nearly at the end. The shape of the story. We have traveled a long distance tonight, from the end times, the destruction of a world that had existed for thousands of years, consumed by chaos in a catastrophe so complete that 99 in every 100 beings who had ever lived on it died. Through the void between worlds, where Sigmar held on to a burning core and refused to let go. Through Dracothian finding him and guiding him to the mortal realms. Through the Age of Myth, the Golden Age, the Pantheon of Order, the civilizations that rose and flourished across 8 planes of existence. Through the fractures that brought it down. Nagash's scheming, Gorka Morka's boredom, the patient corrosion of chaos from within. Through the Age of Chaos, 500 years of darkness, the long wait in Azir, Sigmar watching what he had helped build be consumed. Through the first lightning strike, the Stormcast Eternals descending on Akshi and beginning the Realmgate Wars. Through the rebuilding of alliances, Alarielle restored, Galmaraz recovered, the cities of Sigmar founded in hostile territory. Through Nagash's Necroquake and the Soul Wars, and Lady Olinda leading spectral hosts across every realm. Through Morathi's apotheosis and Teclis's punishment of Nagash. Through Kragnos waking and the era of the beast. Through the Dawnbringer Crusades and the hour of ruin. The whole of it, from destruction to rebuilding to new crisis. What does all of this mean? Amaikern, a world that refuses to give up. The central thing that Age of Sigmar is doing, what distinguishes it from the old world it replaced, and from many other fantasy settings, is telling the story of a world that was destroyed and chose to exist anyway. The old world ended. That is not a metaphor. The planet was torn apart by chaos, its civilizations obliterated, its history consumed. By any ordinary measure, the story should have ended there. It did not end. Sigmar held on. Other gods survived. The mortal realms formed from the energies of the destruction. New civilizations built from the fragments of the old ones. New peoples arose, and the conflict that had defined the old world resumed, on a larger stage, with higher stakes, among beings who carried the memory of having already lost everything once. Age of Sigmar is the story of beings who know what it means to lose everything and chose to build anyway. This is the specifically human quality that the setting is organized around, not the superhuman qualities of the gods, not the divine power of the Stormcast Eternals, not the immortal patience of Nagash, but the specific mortal quality of looking at a world that has been destroyed and deciding to make something in it regardless. The cities of Sigmar are the most direct expression of this. They are built in hostile territory. They are defended at enormous cost. They fall sometimes. The hour of ruin has demonstrated that even the greatest cities can be lost. And when they fall, people survive the fall and begin planning what to build next. The Dawnbringer Crusades continue even when individual crusades are destroyed. The builders keep building because the alternative, giving up, accepting that the darkness will have everything, is the one thing that the mortal realm's history suggests is fatal. Chaos wins when everything stops. It cannot win against something that does not stop. The cost of continuation. There is a grief at the heart of Age of Sigmar that the setting never quite lets you forget. The Stormcast Eternals are losing themselves. The most capable warriors in Sigmar's army are also the most damaged, veterans of too many reforgings, each return taking something they cannot get back, approaching a state where what remains is the shape of a person rather than a person. Sigmar is aware of this. He has no clean solution. He uses them anyway because the alternative is losing. What does it mean to save a world at the cost of the people saving it? This is not a question Age of Sigmar resolves. It holds it open across the entire history of the Stormcast Eternals, across every campaign, across every death and reforging. The sacrifice is ongoing. The cost is ongoing. The war is ongoing. The mortal populations of the cities of Sigmar carry their own grief. The knowledge that the city they live in might fall, that the frontier is close, that what their parents built might not be there for their children. The specific courage of people who build anyway in the face of this knowledge is one of the setting's most consistent emotional notes. Nagash is not wrong, that all of this ends in death. The great necromancer's theological position, that every soul belongs to him eventually, is accurate in the limited sense that everything mortal dies. What he misses is what happens in between, the specific value of the living time, the quality of what is built and experienced and loved in the interval between birth and death. This is what the mortal realms are defending, not immortality. None of them have that, not the absence of loss. Loss is everywhere, the specific texture of being alive in a world that wants you dead. Sigmar's question. Sigmar Heldenhammer started as a mortal barbarian king who united tribes and founded an empire and eventually became something divine. He is the only god in Age of Sigmar whose mortal origins are fully known and whose transformation from mortal to divine is documented. And this matters because it means that Sigmar remembers what it was to be mortal. He knows what the people in the cities of Sigmar feel, not abstractly, not through divine perception, but from memory. He was them once. He prayed to gods who may or may not have been listening. He led armies of people who could die, and did. He built something knowing it could be taken. The question his existence asks is the question the setting asks. What do you do with the knowledge that everything can be destroyed? The old world was destroyed. The mortal realms have been devastated repeatedly. There is no guarantee that what is being built now will last. Sigmar's answer, the answer encoded in every campaign, every city, every Stormcast deployment, is that you build anyway. You hold on when you are holding on to ash and drifting through nothing. You let the Drake guide you to whatever exists in the aftermath, and then you begin again. This is not presented as certainly correct. Nagash's argument that the building is temporary and the death is permanent, so you might as well organize around the permanent rather than the temporary, is coherent. The Chaos God's argument that the effort of maintaining order against entropy is futile and the natural state of things is change and destruction is coherent. Even Gorkamorka's argument that the fight is the point and worrying about what you're fighting for is missing the joy of the fighting itself is coherent. Age of Sigmar does not prove that Sigmar is right. It shows what it looks like to live as if he is. What remains unresolved? The mortal realms. As of the most recent events in the timeline, I have several things unresolved that the story is clearly building toward. Slaanesh is still imprisoned, but the chains are weakening. The newborn, Slaanesh's escaped fragment, is growing. The eventual full release of the Dark Prince, and what that means for the elven peoples whose souls are still being extracted from him, is one of the largest outstanding questions in the setting. Nagash is sealed but not defeated. His patience is geological. He will find a way out. When he does, his plans will have taken into account everything that happened while he was contained. The Hellsmiths of Hashut are entering the realms with capabilities that are not yet fully understood. Hashut, the eldest ancestor god, who turned to chaos after being betrayed by his siblings, represents a different kind of threat than the conventional chaos gods. A divine being with genuine grievances, an industrial civilization behind him, and centuries of preparation. Kragnos is trapped in Giran, fighting an eternal battle against Seraphon legions. But his people, rumors suggest some Drogruk may have survived somewhere in Giran. If Kragnos discovered this, and discovered that the information was being concealed from him, the consequences for everyone involved would be significant. The Stormcast flaw continues. Grungni has been working on solutions. Whether a solution exists that preserves what the reforging takes is not established. And somewhere in the darkness, in the spaces between the realms, in the planning chambers of every divine being who has ever looked at the mortal realms and wanted them for themselves, new plans are being formed. The eternal nature of the conflict. Age of Sigmar does not promise that the war will end with order winning. The setting is, in its bones, a setting about ongoing conflict, not because conflict is the only interesting thing, but because the specific conflict between building and unmaking, between life and death, between the ordered and the primal, is a conflict that does not have a final answer. Every world that has ever existed has faced some version of this conflict. The old world ended. The mortal realms are trying not to. The specific drama of that effort, the lightning strikes, the ghostly processions, the gargants crushing what someone spent years building, and the mortal settlers who start again the next morning, is the drama of everything that tries to exist in the face of everything that wants it not to. What Age of Sigmar is doing, at its most ambitious, is making that universal drama visible in the specific form of a high fantasy setting where gods walk and lightning falls and the dead rise and cities are built in impossible places by people who have every reason to stop and don't. The mortal realms are not the old world. They are larger, more mythic, organized around principles rather than geography. The conflicts are cosmic in scale. The stakes are the continuation of civilization across 8 planes of existence. And at the center of all of it, in the bonfire light of a city of Sigmar at night, in the tent of a Dawnbringer crusade making camp in hostile wilderness, in the reforging chamber where a Stormcast warrior returns from their latest death to find that something is slightly different, there are people, mortal people, or what used to be mortal people, doing what mortals do in the face of everything that wants to extinguish them. They continue. This has been the entire Age of Sigmar timeline, from the end of the old world to the edge of what is known in the mortal realms. Told slowly, for nights like this one. The lightning still falls, the dead still rise, the cities still burn and are rebuilt, and somewhere in Azir, a barbarian king who became a god is still refusing to let go. Good night.